Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
Welcome everyone to this episode 18 of Beyond the Crime, a psychological analysis podcast based on schema therapy. Today I'm here with Lars Bang Madsen and Shay Addison from Queensland, and we are going to be looking at the Claremont serial killer Bradley Robert Edwards. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be back. Welcome, everybody. Excited for this one?
Episode 18. It seems like it's gone by pretty quickly.
It has. It flies by, and I guess we don't get together as much as we'd like. We're getting back onto it. And you guys had a reason why you really wanted to do this one. You had a sort of trigger.
We were over in Western Australia and delivering some training in schema therapy for the APS and also for ANZAP, which is an organization that specializes in forensic matters and issues, which was a great experience for us. It's Perth is beautiful. Anyone who hasn't visited it is just one of the most spectacular cities to go to.
Yeah. So Chris Hayes, hello, Chris, schema therapist in Perth, picked us up and took us for a little bit of a drive. And as we were driving along, I strangely recognized the road we were on. I have pretty bad wayfinding issues, so I was amazed by that. And I said to him, "Is this the Stirling Highway?" And he's like, "Yes." And I said, "This is Claremont." And he said, "Yep." And I had previously visited Perth only once before, and it was when the Claremont serial killer loomed large in 1997. And so I had a very distinct kind of mental impression of this part because I'd actually stayed there. I went to visit a mate I went to high school with, and he was flatting in Claremont. And so I'd actually even been out to the pub where a couple of, the last known place where some of the victims of this killer had been. And he was at large at that point. And it was terrifying, it was the fear was palpable amongst the young folk because I was like 24 or something at the time, which was sort of right in that victim age.
You were young, Shay. You've given away your age now. Yeah.
That's 30 years ago, Rob.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was my only time I'd ever visited Perth. So when we were driving and Chris drove past, I was like, wow, telling my story and how it was really scary to get in a taxi and et cetera. And we just thought, wow, this is actually, there's a lot known about this case because it's been prosecuted, for example, and it'd be a great podcast to examine, him through the schema mode lens.
Yeah. So why don't we get into that? When we get a little bit of an intro and a little bit of a background into Bradley Robert Edwards. The one thing that stuck out for me at the beginning was, and I guess this is part of the folklore of some of these cases, he seemed like a kind of normal guy, very nothing remarkable on the surface.
Yeah, this is I think the paradox, isn't it? And what makes it so fascinating was that he's just like turns out to be, when he was arrested, just your bland sort of middle-aged suburban dad, long-term employee, like nothing spectacular, nothing to see here kind of guy, just blends into the environment, and which obviously why it was such a shock to the people that knew.
I guess that's a bit of a feature of some of the cases that we ever look at, that these people they're not always the kind of boogeyman type of thing.
No, there's like hiding in plain sight a lot of the time.
Another podcast, In Plain Sight.
In plain sight, yeah.
We've got all the...
I think that's the name of our first.
There might be another one, In Plain Sight.
I think that was the name of the first one that we ever did about the childcare worker.
That's why it came to mind, In Plain Sight. Well, that's another, that's in the news at the moment too. That's in the news at the moment again. We might dovetail back around another pod and have a look at another one. But anyway.
Yep. So the context for this, so there's a bit of content to get through just to help our audience get their head around this whole case, especially folks who are not familiar with it. So I'm going to dive into the context.
So who is he? Who is Bradley Robert Edwards?
Well, between January 1996 and March 1997, 3 young women went missing from the same entertainment district in the suburb of Claremont in Perth, Western Australia, after a night out. The naked and semi-naked bodies of the second and third women to go missing were found about 3 weeks, respectively, after going missing. Both were found in scrub near a road approximately 40 kilometres outside Perth. The first body, which was assumed a victim, has actually never been recovered. These disappearances and murders became known as the Claremont serial killings. But then the killings just stopped. The man responsible for them evaded detection for 20 years. He was finally arrested in December 2016. By then, Bradley Robert Edwards was a 49-year-old family man living in the suburbs with his young adult stepdaughter, having separated from his second wife for 15 years. He was a lifelong Telstra employee who had worked as a technician since leaving high school at the age of 17. So from the outside, he was a nondescript, functioning member of society. No obvious signs. Edwards was charged with 8 criminal offences, including 3 counts of willful murder. He used a split legal strategy, pleading guilty to 5 historical non-murder charges on the eve of his trial, while pleading not guilty to the 3 murders. His judge-only Supreme Court trial in 2019-2020 was the longest and most expensive criminal trial in West Australian history. Ultimately, Edwards was found guilty of 2 of the willful murder charges relating to Jane Rimmer, aged 23, and Ciara Glennon, aged 27. He was found not guilty of willful murder regarding Sarah Spiers, aged 18, although the judge noted that it was more likely he had killed Sarah, but it didn't reach the threshold of beyond reasonable doubt due to insufficient forensic evidence as there was no body. In September 2020, almost 4 years after his initial arrest and 23 years after the last murder, Bradley Edwards was sentenced to life in prison with a 40-year non-parole period, making him 92 years of age before he becomes eligible to apply for parole. He remains incarcerated at Casuarina Prison, a maximum security facility south of Perth. So the question is, I guess, what makes a seemingly nondescript guy with a stable day job and lifestyle a serial killer for a year and then just stop?
The telecom guy.
Yeah. It kind of flies in the face of a lot of the sort of mythology about serial killers, is that they don't stop until they are stopped. Well, this case is very different to that. So there's an interesting, I think, the psychological analysis around that, which we're going to dive into, is a fascinating part of it. But like everything, his history tells a story. So when Bradley Edwards' life was uncovered and pieced together, the prosecution successfully argued that the Claremont killings were not isolated events, but they were the peak of a clandestine, escalating timeline of violence against women, and that Edwards' behaviour had evolved from breaking into homes as a teenager, for example, a 1988 Huntingdale sexual attack, to ambushing colleagues in his early 20s, the 1990 Hollywood hospital assault on a social worker, to late-night abductions and rape in his late 20s, the 1995 Karrakatta Cemetery rape, and then finally to serial murder, the 96-97 Claremont killings. But then he stopped of his own accord, and none of his crimes, with the exception of the 1990 hospital assault, were detected until advancements in forensic policing, the DNA evidence, facilitated a breakthrough in 2016. At this time, police re-examined a 28-year-old piece of evidence, the silk kimono left behind by the intruder during a violent 1988 home invasion and sexual assault in Huntingdale. The DNA profile successfully extracted from semen stains on the garment was entered into the national database and scored a perfect match to the DNA that had been found under the fingernails of one of the murder victims, Ciara Glennon. It also matched a 1995 rape victim case, which was unsolved. So at this point, the police have all this information. They know exactly the DNA profile of the Claremont serial killer, but they did not have a name attached to it. To find the identity of the man behind the DNA, detectives reviewed an entirely separate, unsolved 1988 attempted break-in that had occurred near the Huntingdale kimono attack. At the secondary crime scene, the intruder had left behind 4 distinct fingerprints on a glass sliding door. When detectives ran those historical prints through the Western Australian Police database, they hit a match: Bradley Robert Edwards. Edwards' fingerprints were already on file only because he had been arrested and fingerprinted for the 1990 assault on a social worker, Wendy Davis, at Hollywood Hospital. This is the only incident that he had ever been convicted for previously. Edwards then was put under tight surveillance, and on the 19th of December 2016, undercover officers followed Edwards and his stepdaughter to a cinema. After Edwards drank from a Sprite bottle and they threw it into the rubbish bin, officers retrieved it to extract DNA. The DNA from that bottle provided the exact forensic match needed to confirm that he was the perpetrator, leading to his arrest 4 days later on the eve of Christmas 2016.
Wow, what a story.
Yeah, so that's how he was caught, just in a banal going to the cinema through DNA evidence. So none of those other crimes had been linked to him, to the Claremont serial killer, until DNA evidence and fingerprint, sort of matching those profiles together. And they realized, okay, we don't just have a serial killer here. We've got a man who's actually perpetrated these violent crimes over a very long period of time that had just been undetected and unsolved cases that had never really been pieced together.
Yeah.
So I guess, for us, we're going to apply our forensic schema lens to this case to see how we can understand the man behind this mayhem. There's a lot of detailed information about what he did, and the general motive put forward by the prosecution was that Edwards' murderous spree was fueled by emotional turmoil, rejection, and feelings of inadequacy brought on by his first wife's affair and ultimate pregnancy to another man. But there's a lot more to this man's offending than the murders, especially when we consider that his sexual offence history spans back to his teens. And it includes stranger attacks on women in their own home, in their workplace, and in public. So why does someone behave this way? How do we explain it? How does a man who appears entirely ordinary become a predator who hunts, abducts, rapes, and kills while maintaining a seemingly perfect double life and gets away with it for decades?
Yeah. And also then stops and goes back to what seemingly normal life.
Exactly.
For 10 or 15 years. So why don't we go a bit deeper? Like, what do we know, if anything, about his early upbringing?
Yeah. So his early upbringing is that really the judge, when they reviewed all of the information about his earlier life, they basically found that Edwards had grown up alongside his two younger siblings in an entirely supportive, conventional household with no evidence of any childhood trauma or abuse. His father worked for Telecom, which later became Telstra, the same place that he got his son a job at, and he worked there his whole life. And his mother was a homemaker. He had an average, normal childhood. Grew up in mainstream schooling, non-eventful, described as a bit of a socially awkward teenager, although he apparently had one girlfriend. He graduated in 1985, turned 17 at the end of the year, and immediately got a job working at Telstra as a technician, emulating his father's career, and he worked there up until the day of his arrest.
It's quite unremarkable history.
Yeah, except for this bit. So at trial, some of his peers had indicated that as a teenager at around the age of 13 or 14, so presumably when puberty hits, he had collected women's clothing. And there were allegations that he started to steal items of women's underwear from clotheslines as a teenager, a practice that in Australia was sort of once called snowdropping. We sort of understand it to be a bit more serious now, but was the colloquial term for it, I think, when people thought it was perhaps a fairly harmless activity.
Or a funny thing or something.
Yeah.
Snowdropping, you say?
Yeah, that was the term for it, but it's...
But it is cool that within the
community. It's snowdropping community.
Isn't
I went
it?
to a presentation last year where the lecturer sort of talked about snowdropping as well. He actually had pictures of snowdropping, and then that was his funny joke.
The question is, why is it called snowdropping? I don't know. Am I missing something? Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't really understand the
that'll have to be another podcast.
We'll leave that for the listeners to look up.
So what we know, and we're looking at schemas, early maladaptive schemas are formed in that early years. Like we're saying, okay, his earlier life doesn't have any very significant markers, except, and I guess what, Lars and I know very well from working with men who commit sexual offences, is that hitting puberty and that kind of paraphilic deviant kind of stuff onset around there and persisting in secrecy is a marker for lifelong problems in that domain. And this appears to be what's happened here. So we don't have much more from that, but then what we do know after he was arrested and everything was pieced together was that in February 1988, when Edwards was 19 years old, he broke into a house in Huntingdale and he assaulted an 18-year-old teenage girl in her bed asleep at night. He broke in when the parents were home. He closed their door and he unplugged the phone. He was wearing a woman's nightie and a silk kimono. He straddled the girl on the bed and tried to force a piece of cloth in her mouth, but she fought him off and he fled. He left behind the stolen and now semen-stained silk kimono. This attack is reported, but it remains unsolved. The police keep the kimono as evidence, which, as we know, turns out to be critical for capturing him later on. But this is 1988. It turns out, what they found out was that this was his local area. He lived in the area, and the teenage victim that he assaulted was the sister of a boy with whom he had attended high school.
So, can I ask, do you know about this? So he wore the kimono during the attack?
Yes. He had a women's nightie on and a silk kimono over the top. Right. And when she fought him off, he fled, but the kimono got left behind.
So he's running off in someone's nightie, like in a nightie.
Yeah, after having assaulted someone in the middle of the night. And he's 19 years old at this point. So he's gone from snowdropping to serious sexual assault and invasion of, home invasion type stuff by the age of 19.
Yeah. And that's a really serious jump. I think that you would have from a fetish such as women's clothing, women's underwear, to actually breaking in, attacking someone, and dressing up. These are, fortunately, a very unusual and extreme kind of offending behaviour that certainly in my experience is not that common at all.
No, but at the same time, he's living at home with mum and dad and siblings, younger siblings, working full time as a Telstra technician, just going about his business like a normal young man living in a family home.
But there's some sort of sexualized or even identity or aspect of this. Dressing up in a nightie and a lady's kimono. If we take the offending part out of it, there's some sort of sexual motivation or gender dysphoric situation. I don't know. What would you derive from that? The fact that he's gone from stealing women's items to now wearing them.
Yeah, it's a paraphilic behavior. So it's like transvestism fetish is typically how that's understood to be. So it's not necessarily a gender identity issue. It's like a conditioned or a paired sort of sexual response to that stuff, so they get arousal by wearing the underwear.
Right. So it's more, it's an exciting thing.
Yeah. I would look at it in a case like this. I would be thinking that this is a paraphilia. This isn't someone that's necessarily going to be presenting with gender dysphoria just because
right.
of women's clothing. And what we know about paraphilias, just as a point for folks, is that when people develop one paraphilia, they're vulnerable to develop other kinds of paraphilias as well. So typically folks who have one issue such as a fetish for underwear or something like that, they usually cluster with other kinds of unusual sexual interests and activities.
Yeah, like exhibitionism or something like that. Like it's quite common. I think the research says it's up to an average 4 or 5 paraphilias that people.
Is that right?
Yeah, that people will have
4 or 5. Wow.
Yeah.
So in these cases, it's nothing to do with identity. It's more to do with being excited by dressing up like a lady,
correct,
or wearing items, or and what do they call it? Autogona something? Is it called autogona something? It's a word for it.
Transvestic fetishism, paraphilia is what we would normally, how I would normally describe that. But then you can see that the breaking in, it's not just what he's wearing; it's the violence, right? So he's disabled help for this girl. He's straddled her. He's shoved a cloth in her mouth. And Bradley Edwards is a big man, by the way. He's not some tiny little dweeby guy. He's a large man. She's an 18-year-old girl in her bed at night. So there's something about the surprise attack, the violence of it as well. And we know that to be, again, if we think about multiple paraphilias, that kind of fits as well. So he's got the underwear stuff. He's got the violence, all at the age of 19.
So interestingly, like if you actually look within the DSM, and I know everyone's got criticism of the DSM and they're all valid, but if there's 8 paraphilias, right? There's voyeurism, there's exhibitionism, there's fetishism, which sexual masochism, sadism, pedophilia, and fetishism, and transvestite disorder. So there's those 8. And then you have these other categories which are even more unusual, such as zoophilia and things like that, but they are sort of not otherwise kind of.
So is at least showing signs of the latter, that the transvestitism in his paraphilic behaviour. But then that wouldn't explain the violence. So
No.
So he would show from what we know from this information, there'd be a tick box for the fetishism, which is non-living objects or highly specific focus on non-genital body parts, so women's underwear, clothing, and the cross-dressing, which produces some kind of sexual arousal and interest, as evidenced by what we consider like masturbating in the kimono.
But then the violence is on top of that, right? So that's something.
What would that be? That would
separate.
be more the sadism part? I mean, is there evidence of sadism?
Well,
not yet. I guess this first attack when he's 18. I guess what we can see is when we're breaking it down, we can see, okay, so there's some red flags early on in when he's 13, 14, where this behavior seems to emerge. People are reporting about it. And then this incident, which is very extreme particularly for someone who, as we can see, doesn't actually have any criminal history as a teenager that we know of. So he's not someone that's dysregulated, involved in the drug and alcohol scene, is really conduct disordered or problematic as we know it. So this is suggesting there's this developing, evolving sort of fantasy world that he's sort of disappearing into, or that he's keeping very separate from the rest of his life.
So you suspect this is not a guy with a broader antisocial personality type or even psychopathic personality type. This is clearly being driven by the sexual part.
We haven't done an assessment on those antisocial personalities, but just scanning his history, I think he wouldn't meet the criteria because he doesn't have the adolescent problematic behavior and extensive criminal history outside of his offending.
Overall, he's apart from this specific behavior, he's fairly pro-social guy, gets about the world, working for Telstra, he earns money, he gets down the pub, he does things and doesn't draw any attention.
Yeah, he ends up, well, we'll get into that as we go through. So this is all 19, right? So next mile point is he meets in 1989 when he's 20 years of age, so not long after this attack, which remains unsolved for decades. He meets his first wife in mid-89. They purchase a house together in 1990, so he starts to nest, he starts to do these socially sort of normalized things. And
this is when he's 20 years old.
Yep, 20 years old.
Back when you could buy a house at age 20.
Working for Telstra, that's right. So in May 1990, aged 21, he attacks a female social worker who's 40 years of age during the course of her work in the daytime at Hollywood Hospital in Perth. So this attack occurred during a routine work call out to the hospital during the daytime, right? So he's called out as the Telstra guy to go and fix the problem. He set upon the social worker without warning, grabbing her from behind as she worked alone in an office inside the hospital. He put a cloth into her mouth to stop her screaming. She struggled to free herself as Edwards dragged her backwards before the attack ended abruptly. This lady reports, all of a sudden everything stopped. I fell back and looked at him. He was just standing there with a blank look in his eyes. It was like he was looking at me, but looking through me. Cable ties were later found in his pocket. He was, picked up by the security and the police, immediately afterwards. Shockingly, no record of the attack was noted on any Telstra files, and Edwards was actually promoted within the company the following year. Now, Ms. Davis, the lady who was attacked, recalled meeting with a telecom representative shortly after the attack, stating that the person that she met strongly advocated for Bradley Edwards. They claimed he was a good employee, that he had just snapped under the pressure of some relationship problems. He'd apologized for the attack and that he'd agreed to get some counseling. He was retained and promoted the following year. He was only charged with common assault. So on his record, there's no specific sexual offence recorded. He was sentenced to 2 years probation and he was ordered to complete a sex offender program, but we have no information about whether or not this occurred or any specific information about whether or not he was assessed and so forth around that. His partner at the time, who then went on to be his first wife, had said later on that the pair had argued about getting married the night before this attack, which she had raised. She said, he seemed a little bit upset about it, but then I got upset. She otherwise described Edwards as dutiful. He would drop her off to work in the CBD and pick her up each day, etc., etc. So that is the only recorded, prior to him being arrested in 2016, that is the only recorded offence that he has on his record.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that it's recorded as a common assault, but if what you're saying is correct, that they actually flagged it as a sexual assault if they were insisting that he does a sex offender treatment program or some kind of community program focused on that.
Yeah, that's right. So what you have here, unfortunately, is a bit of that, system not working very well, because it probably should have been recorded as a sexual assault. And that might have flagged, who knows, that helps with policing, detection, all sorts of things. But as we'll see, this, despite him engaging in that, and I mean, it's the daytime. He was called out as the technician. He's clearly going to be captured. It's very risky, sort of uncontrolled thing to do.
It's very unusual for him.
It is.
Yeah,
and we'll
exactly.
come. Yeah. So we'll come back.
Is control, isn't it? It's whatever control or mechanisms of control, he loses control in that moment for whatever reason.
It is. Yes. And we'll come back to this because this stands out as the singular sort of, outlier in terms of his offending pattern.
Sexual stuff too it comes across as very underground, because it's something that obviously he's building up and escalating, but he manages to keep it underground. Other people don't know about it. He appears very normal, that kind of thing. It's something that he hides.
Yeah. And then in November 1991, aged 22, so, sort of 18 months after this attack has happened, he gets married to this woman. So he marries his first wife. And they're together for a period of time, but only a couple of years later, 94, 95, this marriage starts to deteriorate. And this is sort of the initial escalation piece. His first wife's testimony, kind of said that the marriage began to collapse because he was working unusual hours. And he had also brought a computer home. So 95 was around the time when, individuals could personally gain access to the internet really for the first time. I remember that because I was at university then. And it was the first time really you could get on the World Wide Web and just kind of, explore. So this coincides with her saying he spent all of his time on the home computer. And she felt that he just wasn't interested. He wasn't present in the marriage. He would just leave her to go to bed alone. And his wife eventually ended up beginning a relationship with a co-worker who subsequently moved into the marital home as a boarder. So things get a bit tricky here. Now, this lover reported, again, when everything was being investigated, he reported that, for example, early Sunday morning, the wife would sneak into his room while Bradley Edwards was still asleep in the marital bed, and she would say, Bradley won't wake up. He said, I thought she was playing a dangerous game, but that happened 5 or 6 times. And he said the lover confirmed that Mr. Edwards spent every night in the computer room. So this is 94, 95. This marriage is starting to disintegrate. Now, in February 1995, when Edwards is aged 26, he abducts and violently rapes a 17-year-old girl in Claremont. He abducts her off the street. She was walking home alone after being in the club district on a night out. Edwards grabbed her from behind in a blitz-style attack, bound her with telephone cord, stuffed a sock gag in her mouth, and bound her ankles. He placed a hood over her head before driving her in his work van to the Karrakatta cemetery and violently raping her twice before leaving her in that state alive. The rape is reported, but again, goes unsolved. So, and we know we can piece all this timeline together only from when he was arrested in 2016. So he's, again, got this kind of, all of this stuff is happening in secret. 1996, so a year after this rape, there's marital separation. And this is when the first murders occur.
Before we go on to that, like so it's 5 years after he does the assault on the social worker in the hospital. And it's the same kind of MO, but it looks like from the description now that it's almost like he's refined it, right? So he's picked the victim that is vulnerable. He's attacked them from behind, and this time it's almost like he's been able to kind of sort of tweak, refine, and iterate whatever fantasy he had back 5 years before that was going on. Clearly there was something going on, but here he's actually kind of refined it and then acted on it. And that's an interesting point, because I think one of the things that I've noticed with the offenders that I've worked with who have these very elaborate and very detailed fantasy worlds of similar things like this, they report and describe this experience that over time they iterate, and then after they have offended, and that Bradley Edwards offended once against this lady, we don't know what happened in between. There is an analysis of what happened, and then there is a sort of, a problem solving, how I can make it better, how I can improve it, and so an elaboration on the strategy or the MO.
Yeah, it definitely seems like that.
But there's the sort of, at least by this stage, we don't know exactly if he wore a kimono on this last event, but some of the more transvestic like aspects don't seem to be there, and now it's just full blown assault and dominance and something more traditional in terms of being an assault. No?
Yes. So this victim there's nowhere that I found that she reported he was in women's clothing in this. He just blitz attacked her from behind.
So there's some evolution of it. Like it's started off being,
But when the police arrest him in 2016, as we will find, there's a whole world of stuff that they find. But we'll move on to the marital separation and the first murders. January 1996. So sometime before Christmas 95, Edwards actually caught his wife and the lodger embracing and kissing on the lodger's bed in their marital home. Now, his reaction is interesting. His initial reaction was described as unexpectedly mild. He barely responded. He appeared upset but calm, and the unusual living arrangement strangely continued under the same roof. Soon after, though, the lover decided to move out because he feared for his life, sleeping in the house because of what he knew Edwards had under his bed, apparently, which were a rifle and a baseball bat. When he tried to leave, though, an emotional scene occurs where Edwards, his wife, and the lover were all crying. Edwards actually apparently begged the lover to stay, saying, "I don't want you to go." And so the lover did stay for a few more weeks, but then he officially moved out in February 1996. His wife left Edwards shortly thereafter and moved in with the lover. And then there is an incident where Edwards threatens the lover over the phone. The specific "I'll kill you" threat happened in a phone call in 1996 after she had moved out and officially moved to live with him at a rental property. According to the lover's court testimony, Edwards called the ex-wife's phone. She handed the receiver directly over to the lover. Edwards directly accused him and says, "You're having an affair with her." The lover replied candidly, "Well, I thought that was plain and clear to see." Edwards responds, "Oh, I'll kill you." The lover defiantly answered, "Well, you know where I live. You've got my address." Now, while living with the new lover, Edwards' wife returned to the matrimonial home and has sex with Edwards. The following morning, she asks him if they're doing the right thing, suggesting maybe they should sort out their marriage, but he was non-responsive. He didn't say anything to me at all. He never made any comments about us separating. He did not ask me to return. January 27, 1996, so immediately after this happened, is the first disappearance and the probable murder of Sarah Spiers, who was 18. So the prosecution's case is that whilst dealing with the abandonment and knowledge of his wife's affections for the lodger and the sexual relations under the same roof, Edwards went into Claremont and is believed to have abducted and murdered 18-year-old secretary Sarah Spiers, who was last seen calling a taxi after a night out. He was not convicted of this crime, though, which is important to mention, though the trial judge did deem him likely responsible, and her body has never been found.
Wow.
And we don't know if that victim was sexually assaulted?
No, because the body's never been found. But the second disappearance and murder, which...
So this just happened within a month of the breakup of his relationship with his wife and marriage, right?
Yeah, within a couple months. So the sort of messy ending of it and the moving out happened sometime towards the end of 1995, January 96. And
this missing Sarah Spiers disappeared on the 27th of January.
Yes, correct.
Right. So within 4 weeks, presumably, of when...
So there's this kind of history of this guy appearing quite suppressed in his emotional responding to things that he's clearly upset about. He appears dispassionate, generally,
Yes.
when faced with, the infidelity and things. Even when she comes back, there's this sort of detachment about him, emotionally not really responding, and yet presumably takes out a great deal of anger on a stranger or several strangers.
Correct, yes. It's all projected elsewhere.
Is that something that happens a lot, guys, that you see in these kinds of offences, that people are, often men like this, are very suppressed in their emotional responding and take it out somewhere, unleash hell somewhere else?
Well,
yeah, I would say I definitely have clients where that is definitely the case, where their interpersonal life is so painful for them and so difficult, and the relationships are so difficult. But yet, instead of projecting that sort of, level of anger and rage onto maybe the object of what might be triggering those intense feelings, they suppress that in that environment and then literally lash out. Transfer it and project it onto a completely unknown person. And I would say that is not an uncommon thing for men who have committed serial rape, for sure.
I would also say that the stress of, if you think about it, like that up until this time, he's clearly got these developing, evolving, very detailed, violent, sadistic fantasies that he's sort of disappearing in this fantasy world, this fantasy mode, if we can call it that.
In the computer room.
Yeah.
Correct.
And then there's this kind of something changes and something is maybe very stressful and very overwhelming for him. The relationship ends, his world changes. And it's like that stress kind of acts like a disinhibitor to these impulses to then, kind of disappear from the fantasy world, whatever whatever that might look like, into the real world. He loses his capacity to have restraint over them.
And these fantasies are clearly gone from, just dressing up like a female to clearly some sort of violent fantasies. We're assuming, where there's, themes of dominance and violence and sadism.
There's evidence of that since he was, from the incident when he was, 18?
Yeah, the first offence.
The dominance, the attack, the victim being...
It wasn't just about the dressing up part. There was the need for violence and taking away power and those kind of things.
Yeah, but we have to remember that up until this point, he's assumed to have murdered this person. There's only one offence that anyone's ever aware of that he's committed. Yet we know from the case that he's got this completely clandestine history of escalating sadistic violence. But he's a married man and he's just going about his business. So as we can see with the second disappearance and murder of Jane Rimmer, for which he was convicted, this occurs, 6 months after the first female, Sarah Spiers, disappeared. And so in June 1996, Edwards targets and murdered 23-year-old childcare worker Jane Rimmer outside the Continental Hotel in Claremont, which was the last place she was seen. Now, in May 96, a month before that or a few weeks before this, Edwards learns that his ex-wife, who is living with the lover, is now pregnant with the lover's child. He finds out about this. He's told about this at some point, and the wife, in her testimony, says that apparently he was fairly calm and even seemed kind of accepting of the situation. So he finds that out in about May, and in June, this second young lady is is abducted and disappears. And her body is then found, dumped in scrub in bushland.
And is there evidence of sexual violence?
Well, both of the bodies that were found, one was naked, one was semi-naked. Interestingly, he was only charged with willful murder with regards to those. I don't think he was charged with sexual crimes against them, but you can assume, given that, and
the previous behaviour,
that if you just wanted to murder someone, you don't need to unclothe them. But I guess there can be other motivations for that as well, like humiliation, like all sorts of things. We don't know because Bradley Edwards has never talked about it.
But also that wasn't a part of that, any of the attacks. Need for humiliation doesn't seem to have been there. The one when he was 17 and they assume it was him.
Well, it's interesting. And again, we don't know because he's never provided an explanation. But one of the prosecution's arguments for the Karrakatta rape offence was that it was designed to humiliate and degrade the victim. That was what they presented.
Right.
But again, it's hypothetical because the offender has never given us insight into what his motivation actually was for. We can only infer from behaviour.
I mean, in my experience with working with individuals who would offend in this kind of way, that dominating, having complete control and also humiliating the victim is an aspect of what they find interesting and arousing about it. So if you think about it, you can apply force and violence to get a person to comply with what it is that you're trying to do to them, or you can apply force and violence in excess of that, and that can either be because they lose control, they're overwhelmed, they're so buzzed or whatever, or it's because that's actually a part of what they're doing. That's a part of the script that they have for
so that it's not enough just to get compliance. You have to have the person terrified or something.
Yeah, and that's sadism, right?
Yeah, that's
and sadistic offending is definitely part of this man's profile.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that. And it's an interesting thing. This is just an anecdotal observation that I've had when I've talked to folks who are quite sadistic, is that they actually pay a lot of attention to the victim's face. And looking at seeing them be in distress seems to be something that is very reinforcing and powerful for them in that experience.
So the second person is murdered in June 1996. 3 months later, in September 1996, Bradley Edwards enters into a new relationship with an older woman whom he met while performing Telstra maintenance at her workplace over a number of years. So he'd known this lady, as an acquaintance through work. He initiates contact by sending her a card congratulating her on a work promotion with his number enclosed, asking if she wanted to go to lunch. So perfectly socially acceptable. So she accepts the invitation. They end up seeing each other on weekends and during the week, and they socialize with other couples just like any other normal person. So this new girlfriend, when she was questioned, recalled that Edwards had discussed the breakup of his relationship with his first wife without anger or bitterness, and he was very matter-of-fact about it. His ex-wife's child was then born in December 1996. So the child to the lover. And she reports that after they spent a weekend at a motel in Margaret River in February 1997, their relationship started to deteriorate. She didn't know why. She said she noticed things were different between us. I felt things had changed. She said that Edwards ended their relationship shortly after in March 1997 during a conversation in the kitchen of her home in which he told her that he had met someone else. But he stayed the night and they had sex. And although she never saw him again, this woman said that Edwards kept his promise to take her daughter out for lunch for her 18th birthday in April 1997, which occurred about 3 weeks or about a month after the final murder of Ciara Glennon, for which he was convicted. So he's got this relationship with this new woman. He's doing all the dating things, hanging out with other couples. Then something turns. He suddenly starts to say, well, no, I've found someone else, which doesn't actually seem to be true either. He breaks it off with her. He then murders Ciara Glennon on March 15, 1997. And after she had also left the Continental Hotel in Claremont the same place that one of the previous victims had been. And then a month later, he returns, fulfills his promise, and takes this daughter of this woman he had the brief relationship with out for lunch for her 18th birthday, and then is never seen again by these people. Ciara Glennon's body was also dumped in bush outside of Perth and was found.
There's some evidence that when there's like relationship instability for this guy, that it corresponds at least with the offending.
Yes, and this was the sort of the prosecution's, sort of thesis, that it was around emotional turmoil and relationship instability. But it is curious because according to this woman, he broke it off with her and seemed fine about things, so there are some aspects of it that are kind of inconsistent in some ways. But again, he's never provided an account, so we don't exactly know. But he was convicted of that murder. And then the murder stopped. But in April 1997, so the same month that he's taken this lady's daughter out for a birthday, he meets the woman who would then become his second wife, again when he came to fix some Telstra cables at her workplace following a lightning strike. So he's meeting women through work. He sent her 24 roses to try to woo her, the gesture coming just weeks after the disappearance of the third and final Claremont killing victim, Ciara Glennon. Now, this lady had a 3-year-old daughter whom she introduces to him to let him know that they were a package. By May 1997, so 1 month later, he had professed his love for her and their relationship began to get serious. In June 1997, she reported that he broke down in tears and confessed his assault at the hospital and his criminal record to her, saying he was distraught over his first wife cheating. The divorce from his first wife was actually finalized on Christmas Eve in 1997. At this point, he moves out of the Huntingdale home that he had shared with his first wife and he moves back in with his parents until he began cohabiting with the woman who went on to be his second wife when they were married in the year 2000. Following this new relationship from mid-1997, no further violent attacks appear to have taken place. So Edwards remained married to this woman. He raised her small daughter, who was only 3 at the time when they met, as his own. From 2000 to 2013, he coached little athletics. He was the model of a middle-class suburban dad who provided for his family, went on picnics, was the reliable Telstra employee, living in suburbia in Perth. However, by sort of 2013, 2014, their marriage had started to get very rocky and to disintegrate. The second wife said that she was exhausted by his ongoing dishonesty regarding their household and personal finances. And so she went hunting sort of in a, clandestine way to try to figure out where all their money was going, and uncovered bank statements, which was, formed part of the evidence as to that the police used. She said that his behaviour had drastically changed and things between them had started to escalate. She said she described being scared stiffless and terrified, and she eventually packed her bags and moved out of the marital home due to escalating fears for her safety. Now, at the trial, she was not allowed to elaborate on that. She was cut off from presenting that evidence by both the prosecution and the defence. So we don't know the content of what that fear was about.
Why would they do that?
Because it would prejudice the trial, something, I don't know. It was like a legal issue, but there's no information anywhere on what that actually was about. But she was so frightened, she just packed and left. But interestingly, here's one of these other inconsistencies. Her adult daughter, which he'd raised as his own daughter, remained living with Edwards while the mother had fled in fear. And she lived with him until his arrest the following December 2016. So the mum had been gone for 18 months. The daughter kept living there until he was arrested.
So she knows something, like she's found something, she's come across walked in on him, or she must have.
Yeah. So when he was arrested, the daughter was in the house and he was very calm and completely compliant when the police finally came. And as you can imagine, a lot of them turned up. So, but what the post-arrest information, what the police found really helps us, piece all this together and understand him. What they found was extreme pornography mirroring his crimes. Edward's computer footprint contained a collection of violent, erotic fantasy stories that were extreme. The most significant of which was a story called Chloe's Story. Chloe's story was either written, edited, or heavily engaged by Edwards only a few days before he was arrested. So there was evidence that he had been engaging with this extreme violent pornography and story right up until the point of his arrest. It contains strikingly similar details to the real-life 1995 abduction and rape of the 17-year-old girl at Karrakatta Cemetery, which at that point when he was arrested was an unsolved crime, but he later confessed to it, and through DNA evidence he was linked to it. Now, the chilling opening line of Chloe's Story, it's a first-person narrative, and it explicitly begins with, "They say you always remember your first. In my case, I consider my first is Chloe." The story meticulously detailed a planned, aggressive blitz-style attack on a young woman. The fictional attacker in the story used a hood over the victim's head, bound her with handcuffs, forced a cloth into her mouth before driving her around, and violently raping her. This matched the exact physical trauma the surviving Karrakatta victim described experiencing in 1995. So despite him stopping all the violence in 1997, this is now 2016, so we're 20 years down the track, and the police find this on his computer, having only been edited 11 days prior to the arrest.
That shows the strength of this fantasy world that he disappears into, and how how much he perhaps relies on them or relied on them.
It's obviously quite a disgusting kind of fantasy, and I guess people have all sorts of fantasies in a fantasy world, and his is very, well, it's just outright disgusting and violent. But I don't know, one thing that always comes into my mind when I hear this kind of thing is it sounds like the fantasy world often can lead to a sort of escalation or in the risk and in the behaviour and in the violence, that there are these kind of chances for iteration of the fantasy, and that can lead maybe to violence. But then on the other hand, if you listen to this story, it sounds like perhaps the fantasy took over, that he was able to sort of keep it in the fantasy world and express that in fantasy rather than to offend, for a good 15 years. So I guess my question is, to what degree do these fantasy world type stuff lead to escalations versus perhaps functioning as a kind of compensatory behaviour? And that's a big question.
It's a good question. And I think in this case, it's really, I would say, unusual in my experience of working with men who have committed, series of violent sexual offences. Fantasy is critical. It's a very central process, especially with people who have sadistic violence interests, and that typically, and I guess, this is a bit of a biased sample, I suppose, is that they don't get caught until they get, they don't stop until they get caught. Like they're apprehended by police, and that's when they stop, but that those fantasies can keep, it can sustain them. But typically we're managing them. I guess Lars and I, we're helping to treat and manage people within a criminal justice system.
And it is a bias. These are the ones that got caught.
Yeah. So we have all sorts of other restraints because we know we're trying to say, well, wow, this is risky. You don't want people out there with no management who have these types of fantasies. However,
but how many guys are out there who sort of are able to keep this stuff into fantasy life, and then they're out, in Little League Baseball and coaching all the kids and stuff on the weekends?
We just don't know.
Seemingly a healthy adult, they're able to keep those worlds separate.
Correct. We don't know. I mean, it's an impossible thing to research, right? Because people are not going to come forward.
Podcast, we do discuss some of the statistics on that. It's surprising. Well, if we think about BDSM kind of fantasies, that's a very common practice within the community. And for the vast majority of people in engaging in that, it's a type of, it's play, right? It's a type of sexual play that is kept very much in a fantasy realm that never really goes beyond that.
But it's consent, though, as well, so it's very different. Whereas his stuff is all about blitz style attack, total dominance, total control, absolutely no consent. It's about that, viciousness, right? But forensics in this case also found other stuff, quite aside from Chloe's story. They found that he would use online gaming sites and message boards to access graphic pornography, occasionally interacted with other people online, and his digital moniker is quite chilling. He called himself the Boogeyman.
That's interesting given.
I know. And other fantasy stories were found. Yeah. So there were stories such as, they said that, he had a broader ecosystem of digital deviants, basically. Nicola's story was a dark narrative featuring a male driver stalking the streets at 2 a.m. to abduct a visibly intoxicated 19-year-old girl, which is something that he did. This directly mirrored the timeline and profile of his Claremont murder victims. Sophie's story, another violent rape fantasy, extensive other digital media, including 89 zip files containing extreme BDSM, depraved pornography, alongside thousands of logged pornographic web addresses and a downloaded copy of the extreme pornography movie Forced Entry, which is a graphic film loosely based on the American serial killer Richard Ramirez. It graphically depicts the rape and murder of women. So these things were all found on his computer that he spent all these hours on. And other evidence of deviance he found in his home when he was arrested were homemade sex toys, women's hair ties, sandwich bags, and women's underwear with holes cut out for male genitalia.
Never know, right? We'll never know. It does strike me also that his offending trajectory and escalation, it does also mirror the development of internet communications. And to what degree is this shaped by, this kind of online world? Like if there was no internet, if this was a guy in a village in the, 100 years ago with no internet, does he become who he is?
Well, he committed pretty violent sexual assault with the underwear fetish.
That's pre-internet, correct?
Way prior to the internet.
Evidence,
yeah. So I would say, but you're right, the affordances of the internet allow for him to spend untold hours in reinforced, visual stimuli of graphic, sadistic rape.
And just reinforcing this.
Able to elaborate on it, right? I think that's important as well.
And then getting, elaborate, but also you're getting feedback from obviously other people and writers, and you're engaging with other people's fantasies. You're sharing fantasies and go, wow, he's going, look at this fantasy.
Yeah. And you're right, Rob. I mean, how much does that contain him in terms of acting out on it when he's gotten away with all of this other stuff? Versus, but again, my mind also goes to, this second marriage has broken down catastrophically, right? And then he's doing all this stuff. He's editing this Chloe's story 11 days before he's arrested. It's like, is he on the uphill trajectory again?
And maybe, that's why the wife is so scared.
Yeah, and we don't know because she wasn't allowed to testify. But the final thing I wanted to mention about this was that apparently the wife told the police that Edwards would also masturbate into the sandwich bags and seal them with the hair ties, which I think that's a very odd behavior. I think it's an odd behavior for her to know that he's doing, So there's all this deviancy right up until the arrest, but it's covert, it's in the garage, it's in the home, and clearly the wife has been freaked out for a whole variety of reasons, and she's fled. But the 18 or the 21-year-old daughter at the time stays.
I don't know if you guys would agree, but to some degree that tells me he's capable of, semi-healthy attachments, that he's got this relationship with, stepdaughter, and she obviously feels safe around him. There's evidence that he can be close to other people.
Well, it's interesting you mention that because the relationship with his family is sustained to this day. So he had a very close relationship with his parents and his siblings. And in fact, during the trial, the brother came out and made one statement in the press saying that, defending him. It will all come out. My brother's not a serial killer. And so the parents spent almost every day of the 95-day trial, judge-only trial, in court with him to support him, and that they continue to visit him at the prison, and that the family had only ever known him as this mild-mannered, compliant, lovely son. That he maintains. Yeah, that maintains those relationships to this day.
So you bring this up then, okay? He's obviously got some different parts, some different modes. He presents differently in different situations. He's mild-mannered, Telstra guy, compliant. So let's go to our mode analysis and our schema analysis. What do we think?
I just want to say one point on the whole empathy thing you were saying before. So this is a common thing observed and noted within sex offenders and repeat sex offenders in particular, is that generally speaking, these individuals don't actually have a problem with empathy per se, right? They have
general empathy. Yeah.
General empathy. They're empathic with their family, with so on and so forth. What they exhibit is selective empathy deficits towards their victims. And I would suspect that this is what would have been functioning for him. He would have empathy for his partner, his family,
the daughter, etc.
But towards the victims, there would be an absolute absence.
And I read that with my schema head on as mode dependent. It depends on what mode he's in. So if he's kicked off and unstable, and then he goes into a, predator mode, then all bets are off in terms of empathy.
Yeah, exactly. So my final kind of piece before we dive into that is just about during the trial, right? Apparently he was described as statue-like. He never made eye contact with anyone other than briefly his parents at times, none of the families of the victims, etc. And this is a very long trial. And so even when the horrifying forensic details of the victims' injuries were read aloud, he displayed absolutely no physical or emotional reaction. The only time he was observed to have any kind of emotional response was when his stepdaughter's name was mentioned. And apparently his life in prison is that he's reverted entirely to his original unassuming persona within the maximum security prison system. He lives as a highly compliant, routine, non-confrontational, obsessively tidy and largely invisible inmate, keeping strictly to himself and refusing to speak about his crimes. And his family continue to visit him regularly. So
let's go there. Let's go to our mode formulation, guys, our schema mode formulation.
So what we can identify, I think pretty obviously, is that there's a very powerful detached self-soother, self-stimulator. And this mode would manifest in this fantasy world that he would have created over many, many years and kept very, very secret from people in his life, I would imagine.
Okay, so you think that, the central part of that behavior is that self-soother, self-stimulator part? That makes sense to some degree with the idea that the behavior escalates at periods of stress or instability, that there seems to be more of a risk of this behavior. There's a sort of mood regulation function.
Yeah, absolutely. I would see that. I would imagine, and this is just going on my own experience working with folks who have very elaborate and powerful fantasy worlds in a very fantasy mode. That's sometimes how we label it in therapy, is that they will disappear into this world in response to even the slightest challenges that they might be experiencing, stress or problems or issues. They disappear into this fantasy world, and they're just numbed out from whatever's going on in their life.
So you could be having frustrations at work. He's had frustrations at Telstra, and he just smiles and turns his head, and he knows that when he gets home, he's going in the computer room and he's going to soothe. Yeah. He's going to engage in this fantasy world.
Yeah. But it's interesting because that's not an uncommon process for people, right? But the interesting thing about this case, or the more complex thing about this case, is sadistic violence. That's what he soothes with, right? He soothes with deviant sadistic violence and other paraphilic type stuff, He's not going home like an average bloke might go home and, watch pornography, and it doesn't, it's just porn. This is something entirely different.
This feels like, so when you look at the sadistic part, it feels like, well, that's perhaps an overcompensation, right? That it's like acting in response to feeling not in control, not powerful.
Well, invisible. Yeah, not valued, invisible, not important.
So then you push it to a further degree, I guess. This is sort of almost against the self-soother idea that the fantasy could be more about bully and attack or something of that nature, that the fantasy is about dominance.
Yeah, about being the central character, isn't it? It's like being godlike. You literally got people's lives in your hands, and you are the absolute dominator.
Do you think, though, Rob, that you could have like a detached self-soother mode? That's where you disappear into because it serves a function to disappear into fantasies, sexual stuff. But as part of that fantasy, you have, it involves the rape, torture, and murder of people. That feels good. That feels powerful.
My sense is that as soon as you go into anything like that, I think you're going into the more overcompensation. It's not a simple soothing function. It's a power function. It's a dominance function. And then even I've always thought about this, and I know you and I have talked about it a little bit with bully and attack. I do think there's often a rich fantasy world that often is enough. It's enough for them to go back to their room and think about what they're going to do to that person or what they would do to that person. This is what I would do. And fantasize about it, like a bully and attack fantasy, that's often enough to regulate, and they don't necessarily have to carry through the behaviour, but they're also ready to do so if the opportunity arises. So I see that as part of the same mode. I think violent fantasy.
So he'd have this cluster of modes that he would react to, right? So fantasy mode is I'm thinking about that, I'm dwelling on it. But then he would, within that, flip into a bully and attack mode when he's thinking about the raping, the murder, the torture. No, not torture, not that we know.
Whatever, dominance.
Yeah, the violent ideation for him serves a function of being, of power and dominance. And that is an overcompensation from his ordinary sort of non-exciting, invisible life, right?
There's clearly, can I say, and push back on this, guys, but detached protector's got to be in there, right? There's multiple occasions where he responds with indifference to things and they're all surprised by it. Compliant surrenderer I'll give a shout for compliant surrenderer.
That just accepting the infidelity, accepting the pregnancy. He's all cool with it. He's fine with it. Wasn't really that upset. It's just like an acceptance of
affair that's going on in the home.
That feels like. And then, okay, there might be some other ones.
But the outlier, like the Hollywood hospital attack, right? That's an outlier because the rest of his stuff is calculated and secretive. And it is, and very disciplined with the idea that you're not going to get caught. And he doesn't get caught. The Hollywood hospital attack, he goes there as a work employee. So he's called out on a job. I mean, you're definitely going to get caught, right? Very out of the ordinary. But he has a fight with his partner the night before about marriage, about intimacy, about connection, goes there and sees this woman from behind. Now we know, once it's been uncovered, he has this really deep fantasy about blitz attacking women from behind. So let's just think, right? You have a big fight with your fiance, person you want to get married to, about getting married. Maybe you don't feel so well. Like for a lot of men, that violent rumination, hostile rumination, you don't sleep so well. You go to work the next day because he's dutiful. He gets up, goes to work. He's in this room meant to be fixing cables. This poor social worker is just in her office with her back turned to him. And he just grabs her and attacks her out of the blue, which is...
Yeah, it sounds almost a bit dissociative.
Discontrol.
He's that, he's that pissed off underneath, and then the trigger comes and the mode activates. And
what he's maybe doing is fantasizing, right, as a way of soothing, because he's upset about this, I don't know if we're going to get married thing, and he's in an active on his own. He's got a solitary job. He just goes on his own to fix things. He can be in an active fantasy world to soothe that. And suddenly he's in a room and his fantasy starts to come true in front of him. He's this lone woman with her back turned to him. And he just loses control. But he
loses maybe a sense of the line between, fantasy and reality. Yeah.
And she reports he then just let go of her. Suddenly it stopped. And she's there and she says he's just looking at her, but it's as though he's looking through her. So what mode? Where are we at with that?
Again, we're all speculating, mode speculation. I reckon detached. I think he's obviously realised the situation and then switched modes. And now he's got this blank look on his face, but he's no longer attacking. That feels like a detachment,
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And then, I think...
Like he hasn't gone into a healthy adult. It's not like he's gone from that to some sort of... I think he's just flipped mode, Yeah.
Apparently when he got caught for that, he started crying. And the only thing he said was, "What about my job?" So he didn't give a shit about the lady he'd just attacked. Yeah. But he was crying and anxious about disrupting his work.
Well, you might lose it, mate.
But he didn't.
In the end, you didn't. But,
got a promotion.
I mean, he had a fair concern about it at that stage that he might lose it. I'm so curious. We'll never know, too, how that went down, how he managed not to, lose the job and, in fact, get promoted. Is it because he's had such a good reputation? He was such this nice guy, client guy, that they couldn't imagine. It almost sounds like people have a lot of empathy for him.
Yes. And the boss said, he just snapped because he's having some relationship problems. He apologized and he said he'd get counseling. He's sorry. So they're sort of minimizing perhaps the gravity of actually what happened.
Is that because he presents as such a nice guy, a compliant guy? I don't know.
Yeah, and like a mild-mannered guy that's got no history of problems, right? And his dad worked at the company, all that kind of stuff. You sort of think,
is it some nepotism? I don't know. Is the dad involved in the background? We'll never know. But, is the dad in the background pulling strings? They defend him until this day. So if the dad had any pull, was the dad still working at Telstra? Was he there defending the son or pulling strings to make sure these things weren't looked at?
But after that, you can see the escalation trajectory and what we now know with this access of really hardcore porn, and the first wife is saying, well, it's all he did was on the computer the whole time. Yeah. We know that from that attack, which was clearly not planned, that spontaneous violence, because it matched the fantasy.
I've sort of heard of cases where partners with, of people with, you guys could comment on this, partners of people with these fetishes, where there are violent fetishes, they often become really concerned about risk. If they stumble on the fetish, if they understand the violent nature of the fantasy, that they get really concerned about risk. I've seen that before. Have you guys seen that before?
I don't work with so many partners, Rob. I tend to just work with the guys who've done it. So we perhaps lack that perspective.
Well, we're going for a small sample, but if you think about people who might present with issues to do with a fetish, sometimes they're pushed to come to therapy by a partner, let's say. And the concern could be, oh no, is this is really a problem? This, should I be scared? That kind of thing. And so it reminds me of that, like the way the partner was so concerned for their safety. I can imagine a world in which she stumbled on some of this material and gone, what is this person capable of? This is what gets you off.
Absolutely. And she knew that he'd masturbated into bags and with hair ties.
That might have been the thing. That might have been the...
They found homemade sex toys and, women's undies with holes cut in the front. So if you piece all that together, if she did stumble across all that stuff, I think the average person...
clearly you are. She's stumbling across...
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting, she didn't go to the police, though.
Yeah.
Well, that may have been because if she stumbled across all this BDSM extreme violent pornography, that it's what is, maybe that's legal. Maybe you can access these websites now. And
I don't know. She fled for her life, but she doesn't go to the police, and her daughter remained in the house. So there's some other combination of
something else is going on.
Something else going on.
What's the most common reason people like women don't dog to the police?
Because they're scared, or they don't trust the system. A lot of women don't report things to the police because they don't think people will take them seriously, and they don't think the system will protect them. So they just try to go it alone and, use their own resources.
Yeah.
But if she's found all these odd sexual toys and videos and things like that and behaviors, it's difficult to know. Maybe she's just sort of thinking this is just a really weird, unusual, scary kind of thing that you're interested in, but it's not necessarily perhaps a crime.
Well, again, when she was giving evidence, she describes being scared stiff for her life and she fled. They stopped her from testifying as to what it was. When she started to elaborate why, she wasn't allowed to tell that story, and that information has never come to light. So we don't know what it is, but it's clearly enough to make her terrified.
I wonder if she'd come on the show. Would she... Beyond the crime. Let's get the mode analysis from someone who knows.
Oh, wow. Wouldn't that be fascinating? That'd be very stressful for her. Maybe.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up, guys, with one more thing, because we don't want to miss this. What do you reckon? And I know it's very speculative and from the surface. if you get inside his angry child and vulnerable child, what schemas might be sitting there?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because he doesn't seem to have had, that we know of, any major developmental issues that you might be able to go, okay, well, that, we can see where that's going. But I think Lars has had a crack here at some primary hypothesized schemas, Lars?
Yeah, so maybe emotional deprivation. Maybe that's sort of evident in the fact that he develops his fetish for women's underwear at a very young age. And that seems to happen in the context of social awkwardness, which perhaps suggests this is a young person that already has this internalized belief that genuine emotional and physical intimacy is unavailable, unattainable through normal channels. And the fetish object serves as some kind of symbolic, controllable substitute for relational connection, maybe. In a way, the secret and solitary nature of the behavior further, I guess that suggests to, for at least his experience, that there's an absence of safe, validating relationships that he can sort of be a part of, right?
I don't know. He doesn't seem to have problems in that. I mean, he's married twice. He seems to, he's getting girlfriends.
But he's got those relationships seem like the initial relationship seems
basically healthy from the surface.
Bringing home the person that she's having an affair with, and they're not talking and they're not engaged in any kind of discussion.
But he's capable of certainly initiating relationships and even sustaining them. Yeah, I mean, he's married for 15 years a second time or longer.
My hypothesis would be partly that I think abandonment, and I don't know, we don't have the history and we don't know why, and it doesn't actually make any sense if you look at the family of origin, but the instability part with things, that it's when things break up that seem to be the most stressful. And there's one part that made me really think about abandonment is this moment of desperation where he didn't want the tenant,
the lover.
And I interpreted that as he had calculated that he had to put up with this, otherwise she would go. And
which is what happened. And then he murdered someone.
So that feels like a lot of like compliant surrenderer, and it's, willing to sort of compromise in order to keep someone. And it feels in the zone of abandonment, instability that, that you do that to maintain the connection and maintain a sense of stability.
Yeah. I think
that can also extend to emotional deprivation. Like, I'm sticking with this relationship, even though I'm not actually getting my needs met, because that's just what I have to accept. This is as good as it gets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think the defectiveness shame one, Lars, that you'd highlighted here, I think that, the discrepancy between his public persona and his private paraphilic world, like, if people actually knew what I was actually into, that makes me feel shameful and I can't tolerate that. I'm, defective, and he keeps
Which is why he's so underground with it, yeah.
Yeah, and that is actually, I would say, from having worked with sexual offenders for a very long time, that is a very core schema that a lot of people have. And especially when they have that trajectory from it's an early onset, deviancy, when they're really just boys, right? 13, 14, they're young adolescent boys.
Learn at a very young age that they don't fit in. They're not like everybody.
Yeah.
And I don't know. There's another thing too that makes me a bit uncomfortable. And it's from the parenting perspective and the family of origin. Like, this is a guy who's been convicted, and these behaviors are out in the open, and there seems to be no urge to have a boundary with him.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can understand their sort of, rooting for him when he's going to trial, as people would. Okay, I believe him. He says he's innocent. But he actually pleaded guilty to all of these horrendous sexual assaults, and it was all connected with DNA evidence, which is probably the only reason he pleaded guilty, right? Because he knew
Correct.
That,
But you know what I'm getting at? It feels almost
the parents
like a child.
The
wrong thing, and they make an excuse for him or something. It's like there's a lack of limits. There's a sort of, what would a healthy, I guess I'd like to think a healthy could be some enmeshment. It could be some other, more like just lack of limits in terms of setting a boundary. Like, even if they loved the guy, you'd think they'd say, you know what, all these things are disgusting, and it's, we feel for the victims and these things. And and he's going to have to pay the consequences for that, for his actions, but we still love him, because he's our son or something like that. It just felt a bit making excuses, sort of, I don't know. Do you see that kind of thing among your offenders and the families, or?
Yes, I would say definitely.
A sort of permissiveness, sort of naivety, active naivety. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a kind of a willful blindness. I kind of think of it like they don't really want to know. They don't want to kind of expose themselves to the full horror of, in fact, what their offspring have done, and I think it's a coping mechanism for them. They can't tolerate potentially that. I mean, that's pretty hard, right? You got kids, I got kids. It's like the concept of really, going in eyes wide open to that. If your child had done that, that's a very difficult thing to do, I think. So I can definitely understand that, but I agree with you. It's sort of, that we don't understand enough about that relationship or those relationships. But they've never, from my understanding, they've never, other than the younger brother's comment to the media saying it'll be proven that he's not done this, that the family haven't really ever come out and.
It sounds like a delusional or something.
But their identities have all been suppressed for their privacy, right? Etc. But I agree with you. It would be interesting to know more about that.
What would be interesting also is to, within the relationships that he was in, the long-term relationship, whether he introduced some of these fantasies into their sexual activities.
Neither of the wives that was ever brought out in court, so you would think that would have been something they were asked.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, so none of that evidence has ever made,
participation.
Yeah, so but what I think is more likely was that it literally he's got these completely separate modes that are for the most part remain hidden and but yet they at times in his life have become the dominant mode of functioning.
But
what do you think about self-aggrandizer? We haven't mentioned it, but I mean, you've got to feel pretty good to get away with all this stuff. Right? Like it's pretty hard to get away with multiple rapes and murders for 20 years.
I don't know. I mean, I didn't hear enough of that. I would have assumed that it had come up at the trials and sitting there for weeks that he'd be smug or that sort of coping mode would have come up, I think. More.
Well, they just said he was like a statue.
It was detached.
Completely detached.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's more the smugness and the superiority. I don't get that vibe from him. Yeah. I mean, from all the descriptions, comes across as very plain, normal, pliant, almost a nice guy, People have empathy for him.
Yeah. So his protective facade would be something akin to the compliant surrenderer.
Yeah.
And the perfectionist overcontroller, right?
Yeah. His work modes, how he operates.
Yeah, perfectionistic overcontroller, definitely, because
identity.
And it's just a thing too, guys. I guess as I'm a casual observer in this space, when people are building up to doing a lot of serial violence, they can have these two worlds, right? They can be the cable guy or they can be the soccer dad or whatever, and seemingly be normal, but then people aren't aware of this other life.
In my experience, that's only where you have a very well-developed overcontrol, like perfectionistic overcontroller or obsessive overcontroller mode, because they are in control. They plan, they are, they account for consequences, they do those things, versus people who are just, chaotic offenders who, everybody knows they're a loose cannon and potentially dangerous because you can see it everywhere. Versus this is why people don't get caught, right? Because this guy's totally in control, but he's in over control mode most of the time. I mean, he's described as obsessively neat. That kind of stuff. So he's got that mode on all the time.
And that makes sense too. From a job perspective, I think being a wiring technician type guy, you've got to be very on top of all the wiring, and it would fit the job profile.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was obviously deemed to be a good employee because he got promoted. So so that part of him allows him to stay in control, to plan for consequences, to plan to get away with things. And he did successfully for a very long time, with that one exception of the hospital attack where he lost control in an unplanned moment.
The other one is social isolation that popped up. You don't hear anything about friendships or, peer relations.
No, he had a best man at his wedding who did give evidence apparently at the trial, who said Brad was never really a talker. And, when his marriage broke down, I kind of asked him, are you all right? Are you whatever? And he said, yeah, it's fine. I'll get over it. I'll get on with it and whatever. And he said that was sort of how he described him. He was just a, quiet guy that sort of never made a fuss type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he obviously had, some kind of, at least one friend.
At least one friend. There you go. So, and he might have worked at
well, I'm thinking that as well.
Telstra, Now, guys, be careful of the cable guy. This is what I take out of this sort of thing. You don't know who you're talking to. We don't want to freak you all out. But it's been great talking to you guys today about this particular case. We like digging around in some of these old cases where there's been a verdict and there's a lot of stuff in the public domain.
Before we sort of wind up, I just want to make a comment on why we think he stopped. What was happening for him about stopping, because we never really gave an opinion on that. He just stopped killing.
So come on, Shay. Why do you think he stopped?
Well, Lars, I think your technical explanations about the, how that, and you kind of alluded to it before, Rob, about maybe the, he in some way his needs are getting met through this second marriage, and the daughter being the dad, right? Yeah. Having this kind of.
I think he had some semi-healthy attachments going on.
Yeah, but what we know is that he also, maintained that deviant interest on the internet, and maybe that was, while life was going okay, that was enough for him
to keep a lid on it.
Yeah, it was enough for him. Exactly, to access it in a fantasy digital world, rather than acting on it like he had previously done. But I would say it stands out as a fairly unusual case in terms of that trajectory of desistance. It's not very common. Although there are other cases in the world where that's happened. There's some American cases which the same thing.
So here's a controversial question. Does that mean that to some degree there was some healthy adult there that wanted to maintain his relationships and so had a motivation to keep a lid on the behaviour and the escalation and to not offend in such a way that could, trouble?
Yeah, I mean, his ex-wife had a baby with the lover, and here he forms a relationship with this woman who wants to be with him, and he's got a ready-made family, which probably makes him feel much better about himself and his life, I would say. So I think he doesn't want to jeopardize that, right? He wants the white picket fence. He wants the life.
And then he wants the computer room where he can do some sort of limited version of this.
He's got the parallel deviancy functioning at the same time. So he's got both of these worlds in parallel to each other. Just, no one knows about it.
All we do know is that there's a period of stability in his relational world. And then we get this de-escalation in the behavior, but not eradication.
No. So that still remains active. What's interesting, I think also, and this may be a factor, or just something to think about, it's that he then forms a very strong connection to his stepchild, right? And then raises her as his own. So is it 3 years old when they get together?
Yep. Yeah. So and she's 21, I think, when he gets arrested. And she's living in the house.
That time period, when he gets together with her just at the end of the last murder, then in effectively he's got this ready-made family with a young child that he then adopts or acts as a father figure to, and then becomes involved in her life and in little athletics and all that kind of stuff. So he's if you think, he's got some kind of role in his life where he's caring for a child.
Absolutely. And does that mean there's a level of healthy adult there that he can participate in normal healthy attachments and attachment behaviours and roles?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, she was interviewed by police. She wasn't giving evidence at trial, but what she said to the police, this is interesting, is she said that her father's would sprout the greatest virtue was honesty.
Her father?
That him. She said that he would sprout to her that the greatest virtue was honesty. So that's either complete conning manipulator because he knows his entire life is deceitful, right? Or he's not delusional, but it feels delusional, doesn't it? But it's like he's wanting something and he's wanting to coach and teach her about, important values, but he doesn't live by those values.
I mean, it could be a thing of do as I say, not as I do as well. Like he might understand that as a virtue.
Yeah, because the deceit and the
Yeah.
manipulate a part of him, which we haven't mentioned before, is clearly a very big part of his life. Keeping secrets, being conning, manipulative, deceitful, maintaining secrets. Yet here he is saying to this daughter whom he clearly, values and cherishes, is that, honesty is the greatest virtue.
And we can derive that, right? There seems to have been a fair income attachment. Like for your mum to move out, your blood mum to move out, and you stay with your stepfather.
Yeah.
There must have been some sort of, she felt safe.
Yeah.
There's a bond there.
Absolutely. I can't imagine the shock that those poor people, her in particular, must have had when, this all comes out,
the dark side.
Yeah. Well, the impact on her life forever after.
Yeah. All right, guys. I think we've done our job today, unpacked this case. And now what's coming up? What's the next one we're going to tackle?
What is coming up is we are going to tackle the Epstein files. Jeffrey Epstein.
Wow. Good luck to us.
Good luck to us. So that might be 1 or 2 podcasts, maybe 2.
Yeah.
It feels weighty.
Yeah, but it's got to be done. It's got to be done. It's, okay. All right. Well, we're going to have to do our research on that one. And there's, of course, a lot of files. So it might even be 3. Who knows?
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, we might have to do something like what we know, the early years or something, because there was a period up until I think he initially went to jail and then was released somewhere around 2012 or something. We might have to split up by time.
Yeah. We'll have a think about how to structure him, because it's a lot. But yeah, so Jeffrey Epstein, watch this space, everybody.
Yeah. Who's that guy that does the podcast and it goes for 3 hours all the time?
Joe Rogan.
We could do like a Joe Rogan style, 4-hour podcast on Jeffrey Epstein. No, we're not going to do that. All right, guys. Until next time on Beyond the Crime. See you later, guys.
See you later.
Rob. See you, Lars. Bye.
If you're interested in learning more about schema therapy, join us in a hero's journey. The Schema Therapy Sessions at schematherapytrainingonline.com.